So for my final project, I'm going to be talking about power and big tech and how we touched on that theme throughout the course. I'm going to be connecting 5 articles that we read, and at the end, I'll be connecting it to something called Prop 22, which I'll introduce later on. Um, the main question I want to talk through is how does big tech leverage its power? And specifically, I want to talk through it in terms of how we talked about it in this course. So I think looking over our readings, that there are kind of 3 steps that big tech uses in order to leverage its power. So the first step I would say is defining the scope of society's conversation. So that could be things like limiting the questions that people ask about big tech, or getting ahead of regulators with ethics washing. I mean, I'll talk a lot more about that in the next few slides. And then I would say the second step is after it's already defined the scope of where the conversation is going, using its platforms to influence public opinion on relevant issues. One great example of this is Google playing with its algorithm in order to favor search results that it looks favorably upon. And then the third step, I think, is pushing its own interests. So that's pushing big tech's own interests in order to bolster its bottom line. And the perfect example of that, I think, is Prop 22, which I'll introduce at the end. So the first article I want to bring up is The Problem with AI Ethics by Vincent. This article really shows how big tech kind of defines the scope of our conversation, because it talks about ethics watching, which is when big tech creates sham ethics boards in order to shield itself from tough questions by regulators. So in doing this, they guide the conversation around tech ethics so that it stays comfortable for them. And they also suck up expertise into their own ethics boards so that those experts don't flow to more hostile regulators like the government, for example. And this quote really stood out, which is that most of the ethics principles developed now lack any institutional framework. They're non-binding. This makes it very easy for companies to look at ethical issues and go, that's important, but continue with whatever it is they were doing beforehand. So essentially, they use this as a shield. Another example where I think perhaps it's not explicit in the article, but I think it's really important to look at who's defining the scope of the conversation is found in Why the Moral Machine is a Monster by Jakes. So Jakes argues for a structural approach to autonomous vehicle safety. She says that society should change its environment in order to make fatal crashes less likely. I would agree with that overall, but I think we need to focus on power. So we need to ask ourselves, who is society, and who's going to be driving the structural reforms? And also something that goes along with that, are huge structural reforms and democracy mutually exclusive? So do you have to, if you want huge structural reforms led by experts, do you have to make citizens give up their oversight power? And who is deciding which structures need to be examined? And I think personally that if we go through Jake's approach without asking ourselves these questions, like who's deciding which structures need to be examined, it's going to flow to autonomous vehicle companies. And they are going to start asking these questions and pushing for structural reforms. That risks excluding ordinary citizens who might not anymore have input into this discussion and whose lives will be perhaps sacrificed by the rules that the company's experts create. And then a third example of big tech companies kind of defining the scope of our conversation is found in The Seductive Diversion of Solving Bias in Artificial Intelligence by Powles. And so the article argues that tech companies have tried to define the argument around AI, and focus strictly on AI bias, when the real thing that we should be asking ourselves is, should we allow AI to take over our systems? And I would take it again a step further and say, we need to have an even broader conversation that accounts for the determinants of AI bias. So why are some groups so marginalized that they are prone to AI bias in the first place? And obviously these structural issues are uncomfortable for tech companies, because if, let's say, we decide that we shouldn't really implement artificial intelligence in some parts of our society, they don't benefit from that. So they want to guide our focus away from those issues. And that's the first way that they exert their power. Now, they don't only, big tech companies don't only define the scope of our conversation. Obviously, that doesn't really do anything for them directly. What they do as a next step is they use their platforms to influence public opinion on relevant issues. And so there is something around this theme that is a little bit more implicit in To Predict and Serve by Lum and Isaac. And this article talks about predictive policing systems, which use AI to more efficiently predict crime than officers alone can. The issue with these predictive policing systems is that they unfairly target already marginalized communities because they're trained on biased data that's collected by biased police officers. But of course, tech companies, they want governments to adopt predictive policing because they make money from that. And so they have extolled the efficiency gains from AI and tried to brush away the increased bias that it creates. It looks like tech companies have used their ability to guide this conversation in order to impose a more utilitarian framework on the way that the government and the media speak about justice. And that with that framework, predictive policing is just because it increases efficiency. But it's important to keep in mind that according to Rawls' Justice as Fairness, that utilitarian framework that I would argue tech companies, the government, and the media are pushing on all of us goes against the popular conception of justice, which is based on liberty and equality. And I wanted to bring up one last article, which is Big Data's End Run Around Procedural Privacy Protections by Barakes and Nissenbaum. Also, my camera might be covering a little bit of that title, but that's what it says. So the main gist of this article is that with respect to privacy, informed consent is now useless because analysts can take data from a small group of people who consent and then generalize it to the entire population. But what's interesting and that I want to talk a little bit more about is that the authors claim that privacy and big data can coexist if we develop a rich ethical framework similar to the robust consent structure present in biomedicine. But there's a problem here, which this is me pointing this out. The authors don't actually say anything about this, but I would point out that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google together, they host over 54% of the internet. And Google, obviously, it's the largest search engine. It uses its algorithm to raise pages from oblivion. And that effectively, both of those things effectively, they mold the world's conversation. So if, let's say we, in the US, if we could even get Congress to do this, if we try to pass a policy encouraging more privacy online, perhaps like a really rich ethical framework, a really robust consent structure, maybe even more than what Apple has been doing recently with app tracking transparency. I feel like these tech companies, because of the amount of power they have, they would easily be able to mold the public to go against that legislation and overturn it. And that seems a little bit far-fetched, that democratically elected lawmakers would pass a law and then tech companies would use their influence to overturn it. It does sound a little far-fetched, But that's where I want to bring up Prop 22, because it shows that this can actually happen, and this has actually happened. And it just kind of brings all these three steps together in a way that underscores how much power big tech really has in our society. So the basic story behind this is that in 2019, California passed a law called AB 5. And this law, it's a little bit complicated, but effectively it would have forced Uber, Lyft, and Postmates and other gig economy services to reclassify their independent contractors as employees. So what that means is that workers or employees, they get all these benefits. They get employer health insurance, they get workers' comp, they get a minimum wage, which is quite high in California. It's $14 an hour. They're entitled to severance pay. They get unemployment insurance. And also companies need to pay payroll taxes on workers' income. In contrast, independent contractors, they don't get any of that. They don't get any health insurance, no workers' comp, no minimum wage, no severance pay, no UI, and companies don't have to pay payroll taxes on independent contractors' income. So just to reiterate, this bill, AB 5, it would have forced Uber and Lyft to reclassify their independent contractors, who are their drivers, as employees. So you can see how this is really bad for Uber and Lyft, because they would have to then take money out of their pockets for health insurance, for the minimum wage. They would have to contribute to the UI system, and they would have to pay payroll taxes. So obviously, you can imagine this was something they were fiercely against. And so what they did is they wrote a proposition. It's called Prop 22, written by Uber and Lyft. And it's a proposition to exempt Uber and Lyft workers from AB 5. So if this passed, then it would keep Uber and Lyft drivers classified as independent contractors, which again, if you look at this list, saves a lot of money for the companies. So they really wanted this. And in Prop 22, they made it so that it can't be amended except by 7/8 of the legislature. So it's virtually, it can't be repealed, basically. It can't be amended now that it's passed. So some provisions for workers that Prop 22 was based on. Workers cannot be classified as employees. So workers of Uber and Lyft, the drivers, they're going to continue to be classified as independent contractors. However, Uber and Lyft did say that the workers would be guaranteed a minimum wage of $5.64 per hour. That is much lower than California's state minimum wage of $14 an hour. And also, drivers can only access limited funds for sick days and healthcare costs if they work 40 hours a week. So this is a marginal improvement, because previously, like prior to Prop 22, drivers couldn't access any funds for sick days and healthcare costs. But we have to keep in mind that this is not health insurance. So drivers who are working part-time, they don't get this. And even drivers who are working 40 hours a week must still pay out of pocket for all services. They'll just be reimbursed essentially by Uber and Lyft. So you can see that the provisions for independent contractors under Prop 22 are slightly better than the provisions for independent contractors were before Prop 22, but they're far short of what the provisions would be if the independent contractors were reclassified as employees, as would have been done under AB 5. And just to be clear, again, this is a ballot measure. So in November 2020, voters went to the polls and they said yes to Prop 22, or they said no to Prop 22. And then, well, Prop 22 was passed, and we'll talk about how in a second. So in the lead up to the November 2020 election, Uber and Lyft waged a propaganda campaign in favor of Prop 22. And keeping this list in mind, where I'm going to play Lyft's ad urging voters to say yes to Prop 22. And I just want you to notice how they twist everything in order to make it sound more like this column than this column. So they want people to think that by voting yes on Prop 22, their drivers are going to get a lot more closer to employee status. then is the case, then is a reality. So let's play this ad.
Lyft started as a new way to earn a little extra, open and available to people from all walks of life. That flexibility gives drivers the independence other jobs can't offer. Prop 22 will give them that and more. They'll get guaranteed earnings, healthcare benefits, personal protections, and they can maintain their flexible schedules. But if drivers are forced to become employees, up to 90% of app-based driving jobs could disappear, and the jobs that are left wouldn't have the flexibility they need. There would be set shifts, flat wages, and limits on when and where they could drive. That's why the vast majority of drivers, by a 4-to-1 margin, want to maintain their independence. Protecting their flexibility and providing historic new benefits are what we're fighting for. Vote yes on Prop 22 to help create a better path forward for drivers.
So Uber, Lyft, and Postmates, they ran misleading ads like these. They were on the television, they did YouTube ads, they did mailers, and they even leveraged their own platforms to send app notifications to all California users of Uber and Lyft. I'm urging them to vote yes on Prop 22. All in all, this was a really expensive ballot measure to get passed. They spent over $200 million urging voters to say yes. And then as I mentioned, they use their platforms to serve Californians notification-based ads, mailers, YouTube ads, television. As you can see already just from that 1-minute ad, the ads were misleading, and they tried to use social justice language to frame a yes vote as progressive, even though clearly the progressive choice would have been to choose a no vote. And that would be the choice that would have gotten these workers closer to being treated as employees instead of independent contractors. So as I've been alluding to the entire time, Prop 22 did pass. The No campaign, they did have a little bit of resistance, but they were only able to raise 20 million, in contrast to Uber and Lyft's 200 million. So Prop 22, it passed in November 2020, 59% yes, 41% no. And overall, I would say, and I hope you'd agree with me, that Uber and Lyft abused their power to write this law, direct the national conversation around it, or at least the conversation in California, market it deceptively, and push it through. And ultimately, they're the ones who stand to gain with increased profits. So we can clearly see that those 3 steps have already been followed by Uber and Lyft. And this playbook, it's going to keep being followed because of how much power big tech has. I wanted to end with a story that frames this in a more human context, because many might ask, like, so what? Who cares? Why is this important? So this story was in the LA Times. This person's name was Khalid Zayed. He's an Uber driver who passed away from complications of COVID-19 in 2020. And what happened was his family, after he passed away, they couldn't pay for the funeral and they had no money left. So they tried to go to court in order to claim workers' compensation, because he caught COVID while driving. He was staying away from driving for a few months, and Uber and Lyft gave him 2 weeks of pay. But then obviously they didn't pay him after that, even though COVID was still raging and he had pre-existing health conditions. So he kind of had to go back to driving, and that's where he caught COVID. And due to Prop 22 passing, they won't be able to claim any workers' comp for him, because he is now considered absolutely 100% just an independent contractor. And so the toll that this has on people, on regular people, is massive. And so clearly power concentration by big tech, it's real, and it's terrible. So just to conclude, I would say the 3 steps, which we've talked about in this class and which are clearly visible in Prop 22, is that big tech defines the scope of society's conversation. uses its platforms to influence public opinion on relevant issues and pushes its own interests in order to bolster its bottom line. And these are not just theoretical steps because it's already happened and it's going to keep happening unless we somehow take back power from big tech, which I suppose that's a topic for a future presentation.